A poor old woman devotedly raises an abandoned baby. 2 decades later, the boy returns and gives her back a priceless gift. The wind murmured low against the wooden frame of the old cottage. Helen shifted the kettle off the flame and reached for the worn iron latch of the window, securing it with a soft clack. The glass fogged faintly from her breath as she peered out. Snow fell in slow, silent flakes, blanketing the yard with the kind of hush that makes even time hesitate. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and wool. The fire crackled weakly in the stone hearth, casting long shadows that danced along the floorboards. Helen moved carefully, every step measured, not from frailty, but from habit. She crossed the room and opened a small tin, taking out 3 coins, laying them side by side on the kitchen table. Her fingers lingered on them a moment before pushing them back in and closing the lid. She poured hot water over a single tea bag, pressing it down with the back of a spoon. No sugar tonight. Sugar was only for Sundays or when her arthritis flared up, and the sweetness helped distract her. She carried the mug to her chair by the fire and sank into it with a quiet sigh. On the mantel above her, a faded photograph of a man in uniform leaned inside a chipped wooden frame. Her fingers rose instinctively to touch the edge of it, tracing the lines of his smile. "You'd laugh at how quiet it is tonight," she murmured. "Not even the owls are out." She sipped the bitter tea, letting the warmth press against the cold in her chest. Silence settled again. A silence she had grown used to. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the crackle of the fire fill her thoughts. Then came the sound. Faint, thin, almost imagined. A cry. Helen opened her eyes. At first, she thought it was the wind again, curling down the chimney. But there it was again, higher, desperate. She set the cup down without realizing her hand was trembling. She walked toward the door, heart pulsing, half convinced it was a fox or some half-frozen animal seeking shelter. But as she opened the door, the cold bit sharply into her skin, dragging the breath from her lungs. On the porch, tucked inside a fraying wicker basket, lay a baby. His face was pale, almost grey under the porch light, lips tinged blue, eyelids fluttering weakly. The blanket wrapped around him was thin, the kind used in hospitals, not homes. He whimpered again, the sound barely there. Helen didn't move at first. She stared, her hands frozen at her sides, as if her body hadn't caught up with what her eyes were seeing. Then something shifted, an instinct deeper than thought. She bent swiftly, lifting the small bundle against her chest. The baby was light, frighteningly so, his cheek pressed into the wool of her sweater, and she could feel the chill radiating off him like ice. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Oh, no, no." She kicked the door shut behind her with her heel, moving quickly now. The baby's cries had softened into weak gasps. She pulled the armchair closer to the fire, grabbing the old quilt folded at its side. She wrapped him in it, then held him close, rocking gently. "Hush now. You're all right. You're safe." Her hands moved automatically. She lit the kettle again, pulled down the emergency formula from the cupboard. She had bought it last winter when the Anderson twins had come to visit and left their baby behind for an afternoon. She had never used it. While the water heated, she checked his tiny feet. Ice, cold. She took off her own socks and wrapped them over his little legs. The bottle was warm now. She tested it against her wrist, then coaxed the nipple to the baby's lips. At first, he didn't latch. Then slowly, his mouth opened, and he began to drink. Helen exhaled shakily, a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. He was going to live. Sitting in the flickering firelight, she rocked him gently, his breath warming against her skin. She didn't ask why. Questions would come later. Who, where, how. But not now. Now it was about keeping him warm, about keeping him alive. She looked down at his face, eyes closed now, body relaxing against her. Her arms tightened around him. "You're safe now," she whispered. "I've got you." And something in her voice, a tone she hadn't used in years, came back like it had never left. Morning crept into the cottage without fanfare. A pale, wintry light slipped through the dusty window panes, casting thin gold streaks across the wooden floorboards. The fire from the night before had faded to warm embers, their faint glow flickering against the hearthstones. Outside, snow still blanketed the world in silence, but within the old walls, something had shifted. Helen sat hunched near the fireplace, needle in hand, her eyes fixed on the infant sleeping in a makeshift cradle. A wooden storage box she'd scrubbed clean and lined with the softest clothes she could find. A thin quilt draped gently over the baby, rising and falling with each fragile breath. Her fingers worked slowly, tugging the thread through the thick wool of an old sweater, her husband's favorite, the one that still smelled faintly of pine and smoke. The sleeves had long since frayed, and moths had claimed their share, but there was enough to fashion something small. She wasn't an expert seamstress, but her hands knew the language of making do. Stitch by stitch, she shaped the sweater into a tiny pullover, soft and warm enough to cradle a life. Beside her, curled into a grey ball of fur, Toby, the old tomcat, dozed against the base of the cradle. He had never taken much interest in anything beyond his bowl and his perch near the window, but this morning he'd followed the sound of soft breaths and settled close without hesitation. Occasionally, he opened one amber eye to peer at the child, then blinked it shut again, as if reassured. Helen paused her sewing and leaned in, her breath catching as she studied the baby's face. So delicate, his skin the palest pink, lips parted slightly in sleep. A frown flickered across his brow and vanished. She reached down and lightly brushed her fingers against his forehead. "I suppose you'll need a name, won't you?" she murmured, but she didn't speak it yet. She turned toward the small mirror hanging near the back of the room. It had once been part of a vanity, now long gone. The glass was spotted, the edges flaked with age, but it still reflected the shape of a woman whose youth had slipped through time, like river water, through fingers. Her grey hair was loosely pinned, wisps framing her face. Deep lines bracketed her mouth and eyes, but what caught her was the intensity in her own gaze. Still here, she thought. Still fighting. Helen set the sweater aside and stood. Her knees ached, but she crossed the room to the cupboard, rummaging through drawers and cabinets. She pulled out old dishcloths, clean ones, and folded them into makeshift nappies. She retrieved a stack of linen tea towels and laid them out, examining them for wear. With a bit of care, they'd do swaddling. She found a small tin of balm and tucked it next to the cradle, just in case the child's skin chafed. Everything had a new purpose now. As she knelt to place the fresh clothes beneath the cradle, her hand brushed a carved corner of the box, worn smooth by time. She remembered when her husband had built it, originally to store his tools. He'd carved a small P into one side, for Parker, their family name. At the time, she'd smiled and teased him for being so proud of something so plain. And then the memory came, sharp, but not unkind. It had been winter too, years ago. The air had held the same stillness, but her body had been warmer then, fuller. She remembered lying on the worn couch, a hand on her belly, feeling the life within her shift, the ache that came later, the long hours, the still silence in the hospital room. No heartbeat, no cries, just the doctor's quiet voice and her husband's hand wrapped tightly around hers. Afterward, he had said, "It's all right, Helen. We'll have our own little ones someday. We've just got to wait." But they hadn't. And then he was gone too, lung trouble that worsened so quickly She barely had time to say goodbye. Now, all these years later, a different silence filled the room. But this time, it wasn't empty. It breathed. Helen returned to the cradle, easing herself down beside it once more. She ran her fingers along the baby's soft cheek, then picked up the small sweater again. It was nearly done. Just the final edge. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but steady. "Lucas," she whispered. "Lucas James Parker." The name hung in the air like a vow. She hadn't chosen it from a book or memory. It had simply arrived, as if it had always belonged to him. James was her husband's name. Parker was hers. And Lucas. She didn't know where it came from, only that it felt right. She leaned in and brushed a kiss on the baby's forehead. "From now on," she said, "you're safe. You're mine." The fire popped softly behind her. Toby stirred and stretched, then curled again closer to the warmth. Lucas shifted in his sleep, a small sigh escaping his lips. Helen watched him, the lines of worry softening in her face. There would be questions tomorrow, many of them. She knew she couldn't raise a child on good intentions alone. But those were thoughts for another day. For now, in the hush of morning, with a name spoken and a promise made, Helen let her heart rest. The cold didn't wait for permission. It pushed through the seams of Helen's coat and settled into her bones as she stepped outside with Lucas for the first time. The wind swept up the narrow village lane in bursts, tugging at the hem of her skirt and reddening the baby's cheeks, despite the layers she had wrapped around him. She held him close, cradled in a carrier she had stitched together from an old bed sheet and a length of sturdy ribbon. His breath warmed the crook of her neck, and every so often he let out a soft coo, unaware of the stares that would follow them. The village was small, familiar in its routines and its rhythms, but nothing travelled faster here than change, especially the kind carried in the arms of an elderly widow. As she passed the bakery, the scent of warm dough and cinnamon drifted through the open vent. Helen hesitated at the door. The bell above it jingled as she stepped inside. Mr. Baker, a thick-set man with flour dusting his sleeves, looked up from the counter. His gaze dropped to the baby, then returned to Helen. "Mornin', Helen," he said. You have a little one now?" "I do," she said quietly. "His name is Lucas." Mr. Baker gave a slow nod. "Looks peaceful." "He's a good boy," she replied, and then, without asking, she laid a coin on the counter. "Just a roll, please." He didn't reach for the coin. Instead, he slid a small loaf of yesterday's bread into a paper bag and pushed it toward her. "No charge." She looked at him, unsure, but he was already turning back to knead dough. The conversation was over. Later that morning, she made her way to Mrs. Anderson's place, a tidy red brick house with lace curtains and flower pots that even the snow couldn't quite smother. Helen stood on the steps longer than she needed to, Lucas shifting slightly in her arms. Mrs. Anderson opened the door before Helen knocked. Her eyes darted to the bundle. "I heard you were caring for a baby," she said, half curious, half cautious. Helen nodded. I don't have much for him. I wondered if you might have anything your grandkids have outgrown." Mrs. Anderson didn't answer immediately. Her expression didn't soften, but she stepped back and gestured for Helen to wait. Moments later, she returned with a small stack of folded clothes. Tiny onesies, socks, a flannel blanket faded with wash, but clean. "They've been in the attic for years," she said briskly, but her voice had lost its edge. "Take what you need." Helen reached out, her hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, truly." Mrs. Anderson simply nodded and closed the door. Back home, Helen boiled water, washed each garment by hand, scrubbing gently at collars and cuffs. The water turned cloudy, then cleared again. She wrung them out, hung them on the twine she'd stretched by the stove, and smoothed each piece between her palms. She inspected every stitch like a soldier preparing armor. This wasn't just laundry. It was care, defense, dignity. Lucas slept through it all, tucked near the fire in the cradle. That afternoon, she opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside was her husband's old winter coat, thick, woolen, and lined with memory. She hadn't opened the chest since the funeral. With careful hands, she laid the coat out on the table. She measured it twice, then took her scissors to it. Each snip was precise, deliberate. It felt like tearing pages from an old love letter, but her hands didn't stop. She would turn what had once protected her husband into something that would now shield Lucas. By the time the sun dipped low, the baby-sized coat was done. A little rough in shape, but sturdy and warm. She brushed her hand over it and whispered, "He would have liked this." The next morning, as the sky hinted at blue behind the clouds, she bundled Lucas and stepped into the garden behind the house. The snow had melted in patches, revealing the dormant earth, the outline of the vegetable rows her husband had once tended. Helen stood in the middle of the garden, cradling Lucas. A soft breeze stirred the bare branches above. She closed her eyes for a moment. "This is where your father planted tomatoes," she said softly, though Lucas couldn't understand. "And over there, carrots. He used to say the soil here was different. Kinder." Lucas stirred. A faint smile danced on his lips. She smiled back. "The wind here will tell you things that adults don't tell you," she whispered in her native tongue, her voice blending with the rustle of the wind. "The wind here, it knows things." Lucas lifted his tiny hand toward the sky. The gesture was clumsy, but full of wonder. He let out a breathy sound, somewhere between a sigh and a laugh. Helen kissed his forehead and turned back toward the house. On the front step, a small bundle sat wrapped in wax paper. She unwrapped it carefully. 2 crusty rolls and a jar of jam. No note. No name. As she stood there, a voice called from across the lane. It was the old wood seller, his cart pulled up beside the path. He gave her a nod and gestured toward Lucas. "Is he sleeping through the night yet?" She smiled, throat tight. "He will." The man nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear, and rode on. Helen stepped inside and shut the door behind her. She pressed her back to the wood and closed her eyes. The village had spoken, not in grand declarations or public embraces, but in quiet acts, gifts left without signatures, doors opened without judgment, questions asked with genuine concern. They had seen her. They had seen him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. By the time Lucas turned 4, the village no longer watched him with guarded eyes. He had grown into it the way ivy finds its rhythm along old brick, curious, steady, and quietly resilient. His feet knew every bump in the dirt lane, every stone step outside the bakery. He greeted Mrs. Anderson each morning with a wave that made her drop her guarded tone, even if only for a moment. Mr. Baker had taken to saving him the smallest, roundest roll from each batch. And Helen, though her bones ached more now, found herself lighter somehow, as if his laughter had unlocked a room in her heart that had been sealed for decades. It was late spring when it happened. The sun had just begun to flirt with warmth again, and the air smelled of damp soil and budding leaves. Helen had been folding laundry outside when she heard the sharp intake of breath. "Mama!" Lucas's voice cracked with urgency. "Come quick!" She turned to see him crouched near the edge of the garden, hands cupped carefully over something. "What is it?" she asked, brushing her palms on her apron as she hurried over. He opened his hands just enough for her to see. Nestled in his small palms was a fledgling bird, no bigger than an egg itself. One wing bent awkwardly, feathers askew. It blinked slowly, its breath shallow but present. "It fell from the tree," Lucas said, voice trembling. "I saw it." Helen knelt beside him, the stiffness in her knees forgotten for the moment. She examined the bird with practiced care, her fingers light as air. "It hurts," she said softly. "We have to help him," Lucas said, looking up at her, eyes round and pleading. Helen nodded once. "All right." Inside the house, they made a bed from an old shoebox lined with the remnants of a flannel shirt. Lucas placed the bird down as though setting glass on a ledge. His hands lingered, even after the bird was safe. "What should we name him?" Helen asked, passing Lucas a clean cloth. He thought for a long time. Then, without looking away from the bird, he whispered, "Sky." "Because that's where he belongs." Helen smiled, quietly struck by the answer. There was no hesitation in him, no childish randomness, just a sense of place, a sense of return. Over the days that followed, Sky became part of their routine. Helen crushed seeds and softened breadcrumbs with warm milk. Lucas watched every move, then mimicked her with solemn concentration. They took turns feeding the bird, cleaning its tiny box, adjusting the towel to make sure he was warm. Each morning, Lucas would wake before Helen and rush to check if Sky had made it through the night. One evening, as Helen was tucking the boy into bed, he sat up suddenly, eyes wide. "Mama, what if Sky doesn't get better?" Helen looked at him a moment before replying, "Then we'll still have done our part. Sometimes love is about trying, even when we're not sure we can fix the ending." Lucas frowned, "But I really want him to fly again." "So do I," she said. "We just keep helping." A few nights later, a cold draft slipped under the door. Lucas woke with a start and padded out into the kitchen where the bird slept near the stove. Helen found him sitting on the floor, blanket wrapped around both himself and the shoebox. "It got cold," he said, eyes sleepy but fierce. "I didn't want him to be alone." She didn't scold. She simply lifted him and the box into her lap and pulled the Afghan from the couch around them. "You're doing a good job," she said. Lucas leaned into her. "I learned it from you." The bird, though quiet, was healing. The bent wing no longer hung limp, and its chirps grew louder, more frequent. One morning, Sky fluttered from the box to the windowsill, wobbling, but upright. Lucas gasped. "He did it." "Not quite yet," Helen said, "but he's close." That afternoon, they carried the box to the backyard. Helen stood back while Lucas knelt in the grass, holding the bird gently. "Are you ready?" he whispered. The bird hesitated, then spread its wings, uneven but determined, and launched clumsily into the air. It dipped, caught a breeze, then rose into a wide circle before disappearing over the trees. Lucas shot to his feet. "We saved him." Helen stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Together." He turned to her, breathless, smiling so wide it looked like sunlight had cracked open in his chest. Later that evening, while Helen sorted through laundry, she found him in the corner of his room, tongue between his teeth, focused on a piece of paper. He had drawn Sky, tiny wings against a big blue sky, a sun in the corner, and Lucas standing below, arms raised. He taped it to the wall above his bed, smoothing the edges carefully. Helen stood at the doorway and said nothing. Lucas turned. "This is the first animal I've ever taken care of," he said. "I'm going to miss it so much." She walked in and knelt beside him. "Missing something? That just means you gave it love." Lucas leaned his head on her arm. "Do you think he'll remember us?" Helen didn't answer right away. She looked at the drawing, at the boy beside her, at the soft rhythm of a house, now filled with life. "I think," she said, "that the ones we help, They carry a little piece of us wherever they go." Lucas smiled, then yawned, his body curling into hers as he drifted towards sleep. That night, as the wind sang softly against the windows, Helen lay awake for a while, the sound of tiny wings still echoing somewhere in her chest. By the time Lucas was 7, the shoebox cradle and nursery lullabies had long been replaced by questions, endless, curious questions, and an ever-growing pile of books Helen borrowed from the town library every other week. The little boy who once cupped a wounded bird in trembling hands had begun to measure the world with thought, with language, and, most recently, with numbers. It started in the garden, as many things in their life seemed to. One afternoon, with the sun cresting high and bees wandering lazily from one blossom to the next, Lucas knelt in the loose soil behind the cottage and began arranging small, smooth stones along the edge of the garden beds. Helen watched from the porch as he grouped them carefully. 1 stone per row, then 2, then 4. He frowned, erased a row, and began again. "Having trouble out there?" she called, folding the last of the laundry. Lucas looked up, brushing dirt from his knees. "I'm trying to label the plants, but numbers are easier than names. You know, 1 for tomatoes, 2 for carrots. That sort of thing." Helen stepped down from the porch and made her way to where he crouched. She looked at the rows, at the little mounds of stone placed with such intent. "That's math, you know," she said, kneeling beside him. Lucas blinked up at her. "It is." She nodded. "Grouping, counting. It's how farmers used to track rows when they didn't have paper. You're thinking like someone who sees the shape of things." Lucas seemed to consider this, then carefully shifted 2 stones from one row to another. "Then I want to learn more." From that day on, numbers became a part of their rhythm. Pebbles replaced pencils. Dried beans stood in for abacuses. On rainy afternoons, they sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor, solving story problems Helen made up. "If Mr. Baker gives you 3 rolls each day, how many would you have after a week?" At night, they leaned over the old kitchen table, heads bowed over books and paper. The table had once belonged to Helen's grandmother, its legs uneven and top scarred by generations of use. Lucas didn't mind. He traced the grain of the wood with his fingers as Helen read aloud, her voice soft and measured. And the prince, with nothing but a map and his wits, crossed the mountains by counting every star that led him home. Lucas leaned in, his chin propped on his hands. "I'd like a map like that." Helen smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "You're already making your own." One evening, wind slammed against the windows with a force that rattled the old panes. The lights flickered, then gave out altogether, plunging the cottage into sudden darkness. Lucas stilled. "Did it break?" "Just a storm," Helen said, already rising to light the emergency candles. She set one on the table, its flame soft and steady, and then reached for the tin of dried beans. "Want to play a game?" she asked. Lucas nodded, eyes wide in the flickering glow. She poured a small handful of beans onto the table and began. "I'm thinking of a number. It's more than 10 but less than 20. When you double it, it's still less than 40. What is it?" Lucas furrowed his brow, nudging beans into piles, whispering numbers under his breath. 17. Helen raised an eyebrow. "Close." They played long into the storm. Numbers danced across the table between them like old friends, glowing in the soft candlelight. Days passed, then weeks. On the walk to the library, 2.5 miles each way, Lucas now quizzed Helen on multiplication, reading signs and counting steps between landmarks. One morning, as they sat under the old apple tree at the edge of the garden, its trunk gnarled, bark weathered but strong, Lucas pulled out a scrap of paper from his pocket. It was creased and smudged, a little torn at the corners. He handed it to her. Helen unfolded it carefully. The drawing showed the 2 of them beneath the tree. Lucas with a book in hand, Helen beside him, smiling. In the corner, in shaky but determined letters, were the words, "Me and Mom learning things." She looked at him. "This is beautiful." Lucas beamed. "It's for the kitchen, so we don't forget." Helen reached over, pulling him into a gentle hug. "We won't." But later that evening, a quieter question surfaced, one that tugged gently at something deeper. They were cleaning up after dinner, Lucas stacking dishes while Helen wiped the table, when he turned and asked, "Why don't I look like you?" The words came with no malice, no fear, just quiet observation. Helen set the cloth down and walked over to him. She knelt, placing her hands gently on his shoulders. "You came to me as a gift," she said, "not from my body, but from the world. And some gifts, they don't look like us, but they feel like they've always been part of us." Lucas stared at her for a long moment. "So I'm still yours?" Helen smiled. "Always." He nodded, then tilted his head, studying her. "Did my real mum ever teach me things like this?" Helen didn't answer right away. She brushed a speck of flour from his cheek and looked into his eyes. The same ones she'd looked into as an infant, and then a toddler, and now a boy, beginning to stretch into himself. "I don't know," she said softly, "but I hope she'd be proud of what you're becoming." Lucas said nothing, but the way he leaned into her hand said enough. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Helen stood alone in the kitchen, staring at the drawing now taped above the stove. The boy under the apple tree. The woman beside him. No one would guess, just by looking, how they came to be. But some families are made, not born. And this one, quiet, stubborn, full of stories and numbers and shared light, was hers. By 12, Lucas had grown into his limbs and outgrown nearly every pair of pants Helen could stitch back together. His voice hadn't yet dropped, but it carried a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there before, a rhythm learned from listening. He no longer asked endless questions like he did when he was smaller. Now he asked with purpose. That winter arrived early. By late November, frost curled along the edges of the windows each morning, and the chimney never seemed to rest. One afternoon, as Helen returned from the market, with a sack of root vegetables slung over her shoulder, she found Lucas waiting at the door, jacket zipped, gloves already on. "I asked Mr. Baker if he'd let me help out at the bakery," he said, before she could put the bag down. He said yes, after school and Saturday mornings. Helen blinked. "You..." "What?" "I want to work. I'm old enough." She looked at him, truly looked, and saw how his shoulders had squared, how the childhood softness was slowly giving way to a deeper awareness. He wasn't a boy grasping at grown-up things. He was becoming someone who understood them. She exhaled. "Did you tell him it was your idea?" Lucas nodded. "And I told him I could clean, wash pans and run deliveries if he needs." Helen opened the door fully and stepped aside. "Well," she murmured, "you better wash up before dinner, working man." The next day, Lucas started his job. The bakery was warm and sweet-smelling, always humming with the sound of ovens, timers and conversation. Mr. Baker handed him a clean apron and showed him where to stack the trays and wipe the counters. Lucas learned quickly, with quiet focus and an eagerness that made the older man nod approvingly more than once. Each evening, Lucas came home with flour in his hair and the smell of bread clinging to his sleeves. He would sit at the table, hands slightly chapped, and watch Helen serve up a simple meal, stew one night, scrambled eggs the next. He didn't say much about the work, but every now and then, Helen caught him glancing at her plate when he thought she wasn't looking. One night, Helen noticed her gloves were missing. She found them the next day on the sewing table, carefully stitched along the frayed seams. The thread was uneven, the patchwork rough. but she recognized the effort. That same week, Helen found a small, square package tucked beneath her pillow. Inside was a round loaf of raisin bread tied in twine with a scrap of parchment tucked beside it. Leftovers, but still good. L. She bit into a slice with a smile she couldn't quite explain. As December deepened, the bakery's pace picked up. Mr. Baker let Lucas shape small rolls, brush crusts with egg wash, and eventually ring up customers. Lucas was quick with numbers and quicker with smiles. Some of the regulars began asking for him specifically. He would come home with stories, like how old Mrs. Pendleton tried to pay with buttons, or how the twins from across the street argued for 10 minutes over who got the bigger cookie. One Saturday, Helen noticed Lucas spending longer in his room. When she peeked in, he was hunched over something on the floor, a tangle of yarn, 2 needles, and a look of fierce concentration on his face. He quickly tried to hide it. "I'm just trying something." She didn't ask. Instead, that evening when he was at work, she placed a new ball of yarn, deep green, on his desk. Christmas came slowly, one snowflake at a time. The cottage had no garlands or twinkling lights, but Helen placed an old candle in the window and filled the kitchen with scents of nutmeg and cinnamon. Lucas helped peel apples and hang the stockings, his hands larger now, but still gentle. On Christmas Eve, the snow fell softly, thickening with each hour. Helen was stirring a pot of cider when Lucas appeared beside her, cheeks pink from the cold. "I made you something," he said. She turned, wiping her hands on a towel. Lucas held out a box, slightly dented, wrapped in brown paper and tied with red string. Helen opened it slowly. Inside was a knitted scarf, lumpy, uneven, with dropped stitches and a place near the end where the yarn changed colors abruptly. But it was long and soft, and when she touched it, she could feel every hour, every effort, woven into the wool. "I know it's not perfect," Lucas said, eyes downcast. "I had to start over a bunch of times, but it's warm." Helen couldn't speak right away. She reached out, wrapping the scarf gently around her neck, then pulled Lucas into her arms. "It's the best thing anyone's ever made for me." He nodded against her shoulder. "I wanted to give you something that gave back, not just took." Helen held him tighter. That night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Helen sat by the fire, the scarf still around her neck. The snow tapped softly against the window panes, and the silence of the house felt full rather than empty. She looked toward the shelf where the shoebox cradle once sat. It had long been repurposed. Now it held knitting supplies and a few of Lucas's childhood drawings, but in her memory, it was always winter, always that fragile night she first brought him in from the cold. Now, he brought warmth. And that winter, with the scarf snug around her shoulders and a loaf of bread waiting on the counter, Helen knew something had shifted. Her boy was no longer a child asking to be held. He was learning how to hold others. The season had changed, and so had he. By the time summer turned the garden soil dry and crumbling, Lucas was 18. He moved with a quiet confidence now, his frame stretched tall and lean, the angles of his face more defined, but still softened by boyhood. He had outgrown every corner of the cottage, not with impatience, but with purpose. There was an energy inside him that seemed to be gathering, waiting for the moment when it could stretch beyond the narrow roads of their little village. He had done it, finished school, top of his class, earned a scholarship to a university far away. His teachers spoke of his promise. The headmaster had shaken his hand with pride. But in the days leading up to his departure, the house was thick with a stillness neither he nor Helen could quite name. They moved through the motions, lists, letters, packing. Helen folded each shirt as though sealing a prayer into its fabric. She made him repack twice, just to be sure he hadn't forgotten anything. And when she found him sitting on the floor beside his half-zipped bag one evening, thumbing through an old photo tucked in the side pocket, she said nothing, just sat beside him and reached for the second copy of the same photo she kept pressed between the pages of her favorite book. It was a picture taken years ago by Mrs. Anderson. Lucas, gap-toothed and muddy, holding a bundle of spring onions from their garden. Helen behind him, smiling faintly, hand on his shoulder. It had faded slightly, but the moment still glowed. The night before he was to leave, Lucas stood in the doorway holding a small sapling in a clay pot. "Let's plant it," he said. "Together." Helen didn't ask why. She pulled on her sweater, and the two of them stepped outside into the cooling dusk. The sky was bruised with violet, and the breeze carried the dry scent of dirt and wood smoke. They chose a spot just beside the porch, near where the rose bush used to bloom. Lucas dug, while Helen held the roots steady. When they finished, Helen brushed soil from his hands with her own and looked at the tree, a little crooked but strong. "Let it grow," she said softly, "like you did." Lucas nodded, eyes fixed on the soil as he pressed it down with trembling fingers. Inside, they made tea and sat at the kitchen table long after the sky turned black. Helen pulled out a sheet of paper and a pen, then slid them toward him. "One for the road," she said. They wrote letters to each other, small things, not formal. Inside, jokes, favorite memories. She wrote about the day he learned to tie his shoes. He wrote about the first time she let him pour the tea himself. When they were done, they folded the notes and slid them into each other's notebooks, tucked between pages like a secret only they would know. The morning came quietly. Helen rose early, before the light crept over the hills. She packed a thermos of hot tea and slipped a loaf of bread, still warm, into a cloth bag. She checked his suitcase again, then smoothed the bed he had just left. Lucas came downstairs with red-rimmed eyes and a backpack slung too tightly over one shoulder. "I'm ready," he said, but his voice caught on the second word. At the bus stop, the gravel crunched beneath their feet. The road was empty, except for the lean figure of the driver, smoking beside the idling bus. Helen reached up and adjusted Lucas's collar, an old, habitual gesture that made her fingers pause just a second longer than they needed to. "You've got everything?" He nodded. "I think so." Helen handed him the lunch bag. "It's a long ride." Lucas opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally, What if I don't do well there?" Helen's hand touched his cheek gently. "You will, but even if you don't, you'll still be you. And that's always been enough." His throat worked around the words he couldn't quite say. "I'm scared." She smiled. "Go, dream. I'll be right here." He hugged her then, tight, tighter than he ever had before. And before she could whisper anything more, he turned and climbed aboard. From his seat by the window, he looked back. Helen stood still, scarf tucked into her coat, her arms folded not from cold, but from holding something in. The bus hissed, then pulled away. Lucas pressed his hand to the glass. Helen raised hers in return. She stayed until the bus disappeared beyond the bend, the echo of it swallowed by the trees. Later that evening, when she finally sat down with her tea and the book she always kept by the fire, something slipped free from between the pages. It was an envelope. On the front, "Open when it's too quiet." She opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten in Lucas's blocky, deliberate scrawl. "Dear Mom, if you're reading this, it probably means the house is too still and you're thinking about putting more water in the kettle even though there's only 1 cup now. I didn't say enough. I never do. But here's what I want you to know. I remember every story you read, every late-night tea, Every time you let me believe I figured something out on my own, even though you were always 3 steps ahead. I don't look like you. I never will. But I carry you. In the way I speak to people. On the way I sat in silence. In how I hold things gently. The way you taught me to. You made me. Not with blood, but with care. I'm going to do my best. I promise. And I'll come home. With stories, with mistakes. With who I'm meant to be. But always back to you. Love. Always. Helen didn't cry right away. She just sat there, the letter in her lap, the silence no longer quite so heavy. And outside, beneath the porch, the young tree bent slightly in the wind and held its ground. The city did not wait for you to catch your breath. Lucas learned that quickly. Each morning broke with urgency, sirens, footsteps, espresso machines hissing in chorus. His room was barely large enough for a mattress, a desk, and one window that looked onto a concrete wall. But it was his. He had taped up a strip of string lights, and under them, between the peeling paint and plaster cracks, he built a new kind of rhythm. By day, he studied logistics and design. By night, he worked at the corner cafe, ferrying lattes and clearing plates, his hands always smelling of milk and ground beans. Between shifts and lectures, he typed, fingers flying over a battered second-hand laptop as he coded his own idea into shape. And when even that became too much, he would simply stand, stretch, and stare at the wall above his desk. That wall had become his compass. Across it, neat rows of paper, letters from Helen, each one numbered in pencil, each envelope opened so carefully it still held its original creases. Scattered between them were hand-drawn diagrams of the app he was building, a routing algorithm designed to help small delivery services reduce time and fuel waste. Helen wouldn't know the terms, but she would understand the intention, to make something useful, quiet, and lasting. He read her letters on the days the city felt too sharp. Her handwriting wobbled more, now, arthritis creeping into her fingers, but her words remained sure. They didn't dwell on the past or ask much of the future. They just stayed with him. One letter read, "Don't forget to rest sometimes. Even the soil needs a season of stillness." Another, "I made the apple stew. It wasn't as sweet without you here, but I still made too much." Like always. Late one night, long after the cafe had closed, Lucas stared at his screen until the code blurred. He leaned back, rubbed his eyes, and felt a sudden ache, deep and raw. It wasn't exhaustion. It was homesickness. He opened a blank email and began to type. Paragraphs poured out, about the noise, the stress, the imposter syndrome that clung to him like smoke, about missing her voice, her quiet wisdom, even her stubborn way of folding napkins into neat squares. He reread it twice. Then he deleted everything and typed only, "Miss your tea." He hit send before he could change his mind. 3 days later, a small package arrived. Inside was a tin of his favorite tea leaves, carefully wrapped in one of her old dish towels. Tucked into the side was a note, "Still warm when you come back." He didn't cry, not really. But he made tea that night and drank it slowly, the way she taught him, letting the steam rise, then breathing it in before every sip. When his app prototype began to take shape, he worked on it at night, standing in socks on the cold wood floor, sketching diagrams directly onto the wall with a marker. It wasn't pretty, but it was clear. He wrote equations like brush strokes, stringing them around her letters as though the past and future were partners in the same dance. There was a moment, one quiet Sunday morning, when he received the email from a local investor. "We're in. Let's talk." Lucas sat motionless in front of the screen, the city silent outside for once. Then, slowly, he turned to the picture beside his bed. Helen, smiling, holding a young Lucas by the shoulders in front of their garden. The same photo he'd brought from home. The edges had curled slightly, but it hadn't faded. He smiled back. A few weeks later, the first small check came in. Enough to breathe, to eat something better than instant noodles, to maybe fix the cracked window. But the first thing he did was walk 3 blocks to the post office with a carefully wrapped box. Inside, a soft sweater, a set of wool-lined gloves, and a jar of imported jam she'd once mentioned wanting to try. The card said only, "Found a good deal. Thought of you." She never questioned it. But a week later, he got a photo message. Helen wearing the gloves, mug in hand, standing beside the little tree they'd planted. It had grown. There were nights when the loneliness returned, more like a hum than a scream. On one of those nights, he tried to cook the apple stew she always made. He found the recipe in one of her letters, scrawled between weather updates and small-town news. It didn't taste the same. He burned the edges. The texture was off. In the end, he boiled 2 eggs and ate them with salt, sitting cross-legged on the floor. The picture still watched him from the wall. Then came the offer. A major tech company reached out. They wanted to buy the app. The figure they named was enough to erase every student loan, to set him up in a clean, high-rise apartment, to send even more back home. Lucas sat with it for hours. The contract sat open, cursor blinking. He opened his notebook instead, the one Helen gave him before he left, now filled with sketches, plans, and scribbled bits of his own life. On the back page, she had written a quote years ago. "Build what lasts, not just what shines." He closed the laptop. He would keep the app, build it slowly, build it right. When he finally lay down that night, the tea still warm beside him, the city pulsing just beyond the glass, Lucas felt something deep inside settle. He had not become someone else here. He had become more of himself. And somewhere, in a quiet cottage with creaking floorboards and winter winds tapping at the windows, Helen sipped her own tea, a second cup steeped and untouched beside her. During his time studying and working in the city, there was one thing Lucas always wanted to do. It started as a quiet question, one Lucas had carried for years, tucked deep beneath all the letters and lessons, between warm cups of tea and the scratch of Helen's knitting needles. He had never spoken it aloud, out of respect, out of loyalty, out of love. But love, he realized, could hold space for truth too. He wasn't looking to replace anything. He only wanted to understand the silence he had come from. Lucas hired a private investigator with money from his first funding round. Just one request. Find out who left me at that doorstep. Weeks passed with nothing. Then, one morning, an envelope arrived at his apartment. No return address, just his name scrawled in tight, slanted handwriting. Inside was a short report and a photograph. A man, mid-50s, sharply dressed in a tailored navy suit, standing at the steps of a glass office building. His name, Richard Thompson. The report read like a resume. A tech entrepreneur who had struggled in his early 30s, filed for bankruptcy once, rebuilt, widowed, no known children except apparently one. Lucas read the report twice, then sat still for a long time. The city buzzed outside, oblivious. In the silence of his small apartment, he stared at the face in the photo. The eyes were familiar, not in color, but in weight. There was a pull in them, not answers, but a beginning. 2 weeks later, Lucas stood in the marble lobby of a downtown tower, his hands tucked deep in his coat pockets, the air smelling faintly of citrus and ambition. A receptionist in sleek black led him to a high-floor office that felt too quiet for its size. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the skyline. There was a single bonsai on the desk. Richard Thompson stood when Lucas entered. His face was pale, drawn. The man had read the email, simple and direct, asking for 15 minutes of his time. But nothing in his reply suggested he expected this. Lucas introduced himself slowly, without ceremony. "I think you might be my father." Richard didn't speak for a long moment. His eyes dropped to Lucas's shoes, then traced the line of his coat, then returned to his face. I think you're right," he said, voice low, trembling. "God." Lucas didn't move. "I'm not here for anything. No money, no apology. I just needed to look you in the eye, that's all." Richard nodded, shoulders sagging as he sat back down, gesturing to the chair across from him. Lucas remained standing. "I was young. Stupid," Richard said. "Her name was Elise, your mother. We weren't married. It was messy. I wasn't ready. I thought I was doing the right thing by letting her go. And then, one day, she was just gone." Lucas's voice was steady. "She left me on a doorstep. In winter." Richard's hand clenched slightly on the desk. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know that happened. I never stopped wondering. But I didn't look hard enough. I told myself, if you ever needed me, you'd come. I almost didn't," Lucas said, "because I already had someone." He reached into his bag and pulled out a photograph. It was worn at the edges, faded in the corners. Helen and Lucas, standing under the apple tree, her hand resting gently on his back. "This is Helen. She found me, took me in, raised me. She had nothing, but she gave me everything." Richard took the photo, hands shaking. He looked at it like it might vanish if he blinked. "She's why I'm standing here, why I didn't let being abandoned define me." Tears crept down Richard's face, slow and unguarded. "I don't deserve to meet her." Lucas's gaze softened. "Maybe not, but she'd still offer you tea." Silence lingered, long and full. Then Lucas pulled out his phone and opened the calendar. "I'm going home next weekend. I was going to surprise her. You can come, if you want. No promises, just presents." Richard looked at him with something between fear and hope. Would she forgive me? Lucas gave a quiet smile. "She doesn't carry knives, just patience." They spent another hour talking, slowly, cautiously, about the past, about what Lucas had built, about the tree he and Helen planted. Richard asked small questions, as if trying not to touch something too sacred. Lucas answered them all, not because he owed him, but because this too was part of his becoming. When Lucas left the office, the air outside was crisp. He zipped his coat, took a long breath, and called Helen. She didn't answer. He smiled. She was probably in the garden. He typed a message instead. "Coming home next weekend. Got something you'll want to put the kettle on for." And miles away, in a cottage framed by quiet trees, Helen would read that message in the dim light of the kitchen. Her heart picking up a quiet beat she hadn't felt in years. The afternoon was crisp, with the kind of chill that hinted at winter, though the trees still held their copper and gold. Helen sat on the porch in her worn armchair, wrapped in an old cardigan, a half-finished sweater resting in her lap. Her knitting needles moved slowly now, more out of rhythm than urgency. Beside her, the kettle hissed softly on a small outdoor stove. The house behind her was quiet, except for the ticking clock and the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the season. She looked out at the little tree near the garden. Taller now, stronger. It had survived storms and frost, much like her. A gust of wind lifted the ends of her scarf. She reached up to tuck it back into place, and paused. A figure was walking up the path. Tall, familiar in frame, but filled out in a way that made her blink twice. Behind him, a second man followed, suit neat, but eyes uncertain. Helen stood, slow and disbelieving, her hands frozen mid-motion. The first man stopped just short of the porch steps. He pulled his bag off his shoulder, dropped it gently to the ground, and smiled. "Mom," he said, voice roughened by emotion. "I'm home." Helen brought her hand to her chest. Is that really you?" She stepped forward, barely aware that her knitting had fallen to the porch floor. Lucas met her halfway, his arms already open. When she embraced him, the years collapsed. She felt again the weight of the child she had once carried, the boy who once cried over a broken-winged bird, the teenager who promised, "I'll come back." Now, here he was. She clutched him tighter than she meant to. When they finally pulled apart, Helen touched his face, brushing away a tear neither had acknowledged yet. "You look older," she whispered. Lucas smiled. "You look like home." They both laughed, but it trembled. Then the second man stepped forward. He removed his gloves with care and held them loosely in one hand. "Mrs. Helen," he began, voice measured, reverent, "I believe you know my son." Helen's eyes widened. Her gaze darted from Lucas to the man beside him, then back again. Richard took a step forward, stopped short of the porch. "You don't know me," he said quietly, "but I know of you now, and I've read your story through him." Helen's lips parted, but no sound came. She stood still, the wind brushing her silver hair across her cheek. "I'm Richard," he said, "Lucas's biological father. I wasn't there, not when it mattered, but I've heard what you did, what you gave. You saved him. You gave him a life we never could, ever." Helen's mouth trembled. Still, she said nothing. Her hand reached instinctively for Lucas's, and he took it without hesitation. "I had no right to find him," Richard continued, "but he found me, and he told me about you, not with resentment, but with love so deep, it made me ashamed of everything I had missed." Lucas turned toward her now, eyes bright. He didn't ask me to forgive him. He just listened. Helen looked at her son, the child she had raised with threadbare hands and quiet prayers. The man who now stood beside her like a full-grown vow. Lucas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a silver locket, delicate and simple. Inside were two tiny photos, one of her holding Lucas as a baby, the other of them standing under the apple tree from just last year. Engraved across the surface, in small, steady lettering, "Forever my mom." Helen took it in her palm, fingers trembling. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Lucas leaned in. "So are you." She pressed the locket to her chest, her voice catching. "I always told myself. It was enough just knowing you were okay." Lucas held her eyes. "I'm more than okay, because of you. And now, it's my turn to take care of you." She couldn't hold the tears anymore. They came fast and warm, not of sadness but of something deeper. Release, gratitude, the weight of years lifted in a single afternoon. Richard stepped forward once more. "I won't intrude," he said, "but if there's a seat at the table tonight, I'd be honored to sit quietly and just witness." Helen studied him, her gaze clear now. "There's always a seat in this house," she said softly, "especially for someone trying to come back from where they were lost." Inside the cottage, the lights began to glow. Lucas carried the bags in, chatting about the city, the new version of the app, the strange flavors of tea he'd tried and immediately regretted. Helen moved about the kitchen with slow grace, setting extra plates, refilling the kettle. Later, after dinner, Lucas placed the locket gently on the nightstand beside Helen's bed. She stood in the doorway, watching him smooth the quilt she had made decades ago. He looked at her. "This house, it still smells like cinnamon and stories." Helen smiled. "That's just the walls, remembering you." Outside, the wind had picked up. The tree in the garden swayed gently, no longer a sapling but not yet old. And in the quiet cottage nestled under the darkening sky, the porch light remained on, welcoming, constant, and warm. The boy she had once rescued had returned not just as a man, but as the kind of man she always knew he would become. In the years that followed Lucas's return home, something new began to grow, quietly, steadily, out of the roots Helen had planted long ago. It started with a conversation around the kitchen table. The dishes had been cleared, the kettle was still warm, and the wind tapped softly against the windows. Richard had been listening to Helen speak. One of her stories about a boy who came to school with shoes too small and how she sewed him a pair of wool inserts from an old coat. She never talked much, Helen had said, but her eyes softened when she saw him run for the first time without limping. Lucas looked up from his tea and said simply, "We should build something that does what you did." So they did. Together, Lucas and Richard established the Helen Foundation, a quiet force with a loud heart. Its mission was simple, to support abandoned children and struggling families, not with grandeur or noise, but with dignity, with coats that fit, meals that stayed warm, and doors that stayed open. Helen never asked for her name to be used, but when she saw the brass plaque outside the first center, she just smiled and whispered, "You boys do what you must." The Foundation's headquarters sat in a modest brick building just outside the city, renovated, sunlit and full of color. On the wall behind the front desk hung a large framed photo of Helen, not posed but captured in motion, laughing as she poured tea, her hand mid-air, eyes sparkling. Beneath it, a quote in her own handwriting. "Kindness always finds a way to grow, even in the toughest soil." Helen visited the center often, walking slowly with her cane, her silver hair tied back with a ribbon. Children gathered around her, as if drawn by something magnetic. She didn't lecture, she told stories, about birds and garden stones, about cold winters and warm hands, about a boy who once believed he wasn't wanted, and a woman who believed otherwise. She always ended the same way. And now that boy helps others believe too. Lucas watched from the sidelines, never interrupting. Sometimes he took photos, sometimes he just listened. When his work took him to different countries, building new centers, consulting with NGOs, speaking softly on global stages, he always returned, at least once a month, sometimes more. And every time, Helen was on the porch. One evening, just as the sky slipped from gold to indigo, Lucas arrived without warning, just him and a brown paper bag with a loaf of bread still warm from the city bakery. Helen was on the porch, of course, knitting slow, deliberate rows into a scarf already long enough for 2 people. She looked up, unsurprised, and smiled. "You're late," she teased. "Traffic," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek, "and an old lady who insisted I bring her apple tea." "I like that lady already," she said, nodding toward the kettle. They sat in silence for a while, watching the last light skim the tops of the trees. The little tree they had planted together was tall now, its branches strong, its leaves golden with the season. A single swing hung from one limb, made by Richard's hands and used by neighborhood children who wandered in and out like the front gate was theirs. Lucas reached for Helen's hand, her skin thin but warm beneath his touch. "You've done so much good, sweetheart," she said softly, eyes fixed on the horizon. "I'm proud of you." He didn't speak right away, just laced their fingers together. Then, quietly, "Everything started with you. You saved me, not just from the cold, but from a life without love." Helen's breath hitched, but she nodded. "I didn't always know what I was doing," she admitted. "There were days I wasn't sure I had enough to give." Lucas looked at her. "You gave everything. even when you had nothing. The porch light flickered on as the sun dipped below the hills. Crickets had begun their slow chorus, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a screen door creaked open and shut again. Helen leaned her head lightly on his shoulder. "It's a strange feeling," she murmured, "to watch the world keep moving and know you were just one part of it." Lucas turned to her. "Not just a part, you were the root." They sat like that for a long time, the air cooling, the kettle whistling softly beside them. Inside, the house was warm, its shelves lined with familiar things. The locket rested on the nightstand. A new photograph had been added beside it. Lucas and Helen, seated under the same tree, now full-grown, surrounded by children and volunteers. She wasn't looking at the camera, just at Lucas, her smile quiet and full. Before bedtime, Lucas placed a note on the kitchen table where she'd find it in the morning. "Just in case I don't say it enough. Thank you. For every warm night. For every hard lesson." And as the moon lifted above the village, casting soft light over the garden, the house held its glow. A house that had once rescued a child, then raised a man, then became a light for many. And inside, beneath its roof, kindness lived on. Not as a grand gesture, but as a quiet truth. Because some stories don't end. They become homes,